Welcome to St. Francis College. On behalf of Chancellor Frank Macchiarola, President Francis Dugan, Vice President Tim Houlihan. St. Francis thinks of itself and is the small college of big dreams. And if you get to know St. Francis, you'll discover it's both a high-quality school and a very friendly place. People are generally warm and receptive when you spend time here. Before I begin the program, I want to just talk a little bit about the people who co-sponsored the event. They include Telos Press. Telos Press was founded by the late Paul Berman. It's continued now by Mary Berman, and it puts out a quarterly, copies of which are outside for those of you who are interested. A quarterly that deals with intellectual life in America and Europe. Some of his books have won international acclaim, and one of his new books that might interest you is entitled The Democratic Contradictions of Multiculturalism, which deals with multiculturalism in Europe. In the fall, Telos will be having the L'Aquila Conference. L'Aquila is a town in Italy where Paul Berman was born. On the West, its legacy and its future, and it's really about the question of whether the Atlantic is widening, whether Europe and America are separating. Another sponsor tonight is the National Association of Scholars, an independent membership association of academics. But rather than read the formal description, let me describe the National Association of Scholars are those people who liked academia before it became politically correct. They're in favor of free speech, open debate, intellectual honesty, and discussion of the history of the West. The National Association of Scholars is led by anthropologist Peter Wood, who is here with us tonight. Mary Berman is here with us tonight. I'm not sure where she is. And Peter is the author of a highly regarded book, A Bee in the Mouth, Anger in America. Perfect timing for what's going on in Florida. It also publishes the journal Academic Questions. Finally, in addition to St. Francis, the final sponsor is Encounter Books, edited by Roger Kimball, and it's Encounter Press that published Eben Warraq's The West is Best. It also published, I think the most important book on political economy of the last 4 or 5 years, a book entitled Never Enough, America's Limitless Welfare State, which is just coming out in paperback. This book had a considerable effect on the public debate of the last 2 years on federal spending. New books coming out from Encounter Press include Our Fear of Talking Honestly About Race by Harry Stein, A History of the Nobel Peace Prize, the most famous and controversial prize in the world by Jay Nordlinger, and Merchants of Despair, Radical Environmentalists, Criminal Pseudoscientists, and the Fatal Cult of Anti-Humanism by Robert Zubrin. Let me now turn to the panel. Eben Warraq will open tonight. Eben will speak for 20 to 25 minutes. He'll be followed by our two panelists, Paul Berman and Sohrab Ahmari, who will respond. They'll mix it up, and then I will open it up to you. When you speak, try to ask a succinct question. Not, I'll cut you off. A succinct question, not a speech. Eben Warraq was born in Pakistan, educated in England. He first came to international attention with his 1995 manifesto, Why I Am Not a Muslim. This was followed by his book, he is a Quranic scholar above all, followed by his books, The Quest for the Historical Muhammad, What the Koran Really Says, and The Origins of the Koran. He wrote influentially Defending the West, a critique of Edward Said's Orientalism. Eben Warraq is known as someone who writes with unusual depth and breadth. His knowledge of music, art, and literature, presented in his elegant writing style, have led some to compare him to Spinoza and Voltaire. Elevated company. And when you think about the topic tonight and you think about purchasing his book, know that the first chapter deals with popular music in New York City. And it's about New York City. And about New York City is an example of the West in terms of the kind of magazines you see on the newsstand, the multiplicity of magazines from various points of view, and the different kinds of music that thrive in New York. Paul Berman, the author Paul Berman, two of Paul's books have become a particular interest, and they've become required reading for those interested in following the debates around the West and Islam in the past years since 9/11. His first book on this topic, Terror and Liberalism, Power and the Idealists, and more recently, Flight of the Intellectuals, has provoked considerable debate. His nuanced arguments, which sometimes appear in the pages of the New Republic, are intellectual events in the world of letters. Sohrab Ahmari is a young American journalist of Iranian origins. He's connected with the Henry Jackson Society and is co-editor of a new book coming out entitled Arab Spring Dreams, a forthcoming anthology of essays by young Middle Eastern dissidents. His columns have appeared in a variety of newspapers from left to right: Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, The Weekly Standard, Tablet, Dissent, City Journal, Commentary, etc., etc. He has been described to me as one of the half-dozen young American intellectuals that have to be read. My name is Fred Siegel. I'm the scholar in residence here at St. Francis, and I'll be your moderator tonight. So let's begin with Ibn Warraq's discussion.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, St. Francis College, for inviting us and in organizing the event. I'll go straight in. In a public debate in London on the 9th of October in 2007, I had to defend the motion, we should not be reluctant to assert the superiority of Western values, and my opponent was Tariq Ramadan. There were two others on my side and two others on Tariq Ramadan's side, and this was my speech. We were just given 8 minutes each, so it'll probably take slightly longer. I'll probably take longer tonight. This was my defense of the West.
Tariq,
can you hear me?
a little louder, please.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Hello? Okay. The great ideas of the West: rationalism, self-criticism, the disinterested search for truth, the separation of church and state, the rule of law, equality before the law, freedom of conscience, thought and expression, human rights and liberal democracy, surely quite an achievement for any civilization, remain the best and perhaps the only means for all people, no matter of what race or creed, to reach their full potential and live in freedom. That is why Western values, on which its self-evident economic, social, political, scientific, and cultural success is based, are clearly superior to any other devised by humankind. However, when these values have been adopted by other societies, similar benefits have accrued to its citizens, as in Japan and South Korea. Liberty, the second panel in the triptych, is also an immense human idea. It is embodied in the magnificent creation of human rights. Human rights are, I believe, universal. They transcend local or ethnocentric values and confer equal dignity and value to all humanity, regardless of sex, ethnicity, sexual preferences, and religion. I also believe it is in the West that they are most respected. It is the West that has liberated women, racial minorities, religious minorities, gays and lesbians to an extent unimaginable 60 years ago. It is in the West that their rights are recognized and defended. In the West, we are free to think what we want, to read what we want, to practice our religion, to live lives of our choosing. The notion of human rights and freedom were, I believe, there at the dawn of Western civilization, as ideals at least, and further developed during the Enlightenment, but are only now coming to fruition in the 21st century as a result of a series of supreme acts of self-criticism. Acts of self-criticism that led to greater freedom for a greater number of people. It was the West that took steps to abolish slavery. The calls for the abolition of slavery did not resonate even in black Africa, where rival African tribes took black prisoners to be sold in the West. By contrast, stoning to death someone for adultery is a clear violation of the human rights of the individuals concerned. Punishments, laws concerning inheritance, and the rights of women prescribed by Sharia Islamic law also flagrantly violate the human rights of the individuals. Under Islamic law, women are not free to marry whom they wish. Homosexuals are killed and apostates are to be executed. The Koran is not a rights-respecting document. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness define succinctly the attractiveness and superiority of Western civilization. We are free in the West to choose. We have real choice to pursue our own desires. We are free to set the goals and contents of our lives. The West is made up of individuals who are free to decide what meaning to give to their lives. In short, the glory of the West is, to quote Roger Scruton, life is an open book, while under Islam, life is a closed book. Everything has been decided for you. God and the Holy Law set limits on the possible agenda of your life. In many non-Western countries, especially Islamic ones, we are not free to read what we want. In Saudi Arabia, Muslims are not free to convert to Christianity, and Christians are not free to practice their faith. All clear violations of Article 18 of the Universal Declaration. This desire for knowledge, no matter where it leads, inherited from the Greeks, has led to another institution that is unequaled or very rarely equaled outside the West, the university. Here, the outside world recognizes this superiority. It comes to the West to learn not only about the sciences developed in the West in the last 500 years, in all departments of physics, biology, and chemistry, but also of their own culture. They come to the West to learn of the Eastern civilization and languages. Easterners come to Oxford, Cambridge, or Harvard and Yale, the Sorbonne or Heidelberg, to receive their doctorates because they confer they confer prestige unrivaled by similar doctorates from third world countries. A culture that gave the world the spiritual creations of the classical music of Mozart, Beethoven, Wagner, and Schubert, the paintings of Michelangelo and Raphael, Da Vinci and Rembrandt, does not need lessons from societies whose idea of spirituality is a heaven peopled with female virgins for the use of men, whose idea of heaven resembles a cosmic brothel. The West has given the world symphony and the novel. To paraphrase Alan Kors, instead of the rigid, inhuman caste system of India, we have unparalleled social mobility in the West. Western society is a society of ever richer, more varied, more productive, more self-defined, and more satisfying lives. It is a society of boundless private charity. It is a society that broke, on behalf of merit, the seemingly eternal chains of station by birth. The West has given us the liberal miracle of individual rights, individual responsibility, merit, and human satisfaction. In contrast to the mind-numbing certainties and rules of Islam, Western civilization offers what Bertrand Russell, once called liberating doubt, which leads to the methodological principle of scientific skepticism. Politics, as much as science, proceeds by tentative steps of trial and error, open discussion, criticism, and self-correction. One could characterize the difference between the West and the rest as difference in epistemological principles. Western institutions such as universities, research institutes, and libraries are, at least ideally, independent academies which enshrine these epistemological norms, where the pursuit of truth is conducted in a spirit of disinterested inquiry, free from political pressures. In other words, behind the success of modern Western societies with their science and technology and their open institutions lies a distinct way of looking at the world, interpreting it, and the recognition and rectifying of the problems besetting them. Problems are lifted out of the religious sphere and treated as empirical problems whose solutions lie in rational procedures open to rational intersubjective criticism, not in an appeal to revelation. The whole edifice of modern science and its methodology is one of Western man's greatest gifts to the world. But the West did not only give us just about every scientific discovery for the last 500 years, from electricity to computers, but gave us, thanks to its humanitarian impulses, the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. It is the West that provides the bulk of the aid to beleaguered Darfur. Islamic countries are conspicuous by their absence. The West does not need lectures on the superior virtue of societies in which women are kept in subjection, endure genital mutilation, are stoned to death for alleged adultery, have acid thrown on their faces, are married off against their will at the age of 9, or where the human rights of those considered to belong to lower castes are denied. The West does not need sanctimonious homilies from societies that cannot provide clean drinking water for its citizens, that cannot provide sewage systems, that cannot educate its citizens, leaving 40 to 50% illiterate, that makes no provisions for the handicapped, from societies that have no sense of common good, civic duty, civic responsibility, civic accountability, or from societies that are riddled with corruption. Moreover, the rest of the world recognizes the superiority of the West. It is to the West that millions of refugees from theocratic or other totalitarian regimes flee, appreciating the West's tolerance and political freedom. Millions risk their lives trying to get to the West, not to Saudi Arabia or Iran or Pakistan. Second, no Western politician would be able to get away with the kind of racist remarks of a Malaysian leader, Mahathir. No Western politician would survive in office. There would be calls for his or her resignation from third world leaders, but also from Western media and intellectuals. And yet we tolerate Mahathir's anti-Semitic diatribes. Double standards, yes, but also a tacit acknowledgement that we expect higher ethical standards from the West. There are no jokes in Islam, as Khomeini once famously said. The West is able to look at its foibles and laugh, to make fun of its fundamental principles. But there is no equivalent as yet to Monty Python's The Life of Brian in Islam. Can we look forward to Life of Mo or Half a Mo? Finally, when Christian students cried and died for democracy, I'm quoting here Arthur Schlesinger, when Christian students cried and died for democracy in Tiananmen Square, they brought with them not a representation of Confucius or Buddha, but a model of the Statue of Liberty. That was my speech at the debate, which incidentally we won by 465 to 264. I shall continue, quickly describe some of the contents of my book, and then try and address at least one of the criticisms that has been leveled against my book in commentary. What has made the West successful while so many? What has made the West successful while so many countries and other parts of the world fail to provide adequate food and shelter for their citizens, or to guarantee security or protect human rights? The short answer is the scientific revolution of the 17th century, the industrial revolution of the 18th, both depended on European culture, economic and political freedom, that is, on the institution and habits of mind developed over 2 millennia. But according to Marxist-Leninists, the West is alleged to have benefited enormously by the accumulation of capital through theft of natural resources and the exploitation of slave labor from its colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Similar to this idea is the dependency theory, which originated in the late 1940s and was further developed in the 1950s by American Marxists, holds that resources flow from a periphery of poor and underdeveloped states to a core of wealthy states, enriching the latter at the expense of the former, which are said to be deliberately kept in a state of dependencies. In this theory, it is because of the exploitation that rich nations are rich and poor nations are poor. Jared Diamond, in his very, very famous, very popular book, explains the poverty of Africa partly by saying that much of the continent is quote, still struggling with its legacies from recent colonialism, end of quote. But even African economists do not believe that nonsense. If colonialism could explain the wealth and poverty of nations, it would be difficult to account for the impressive prosperity of the former British colonies of Hong Kong and Singapore and the one-time Japanese colonies in South Korea and Taiwan. Another theme in the exploitationist school is that the use of slaves and profits from the slave trade supported Western prosperity. But David Richardson, a leading historian of the slave trade, has argued that slave trading profits, quote, could have contributed at best only small amounts to financing early British industrial expansion, end of quote. The economic historians Stanley Engerman and Patrick O'Brien have shown that the trade in slaves, which was only a small fraction of Britain's or Europe's trade, did not generate profits. The Arab, so Robert Paul Thomas and Richard Bean found that the greatest profits in the trade most likely was earned by those African who captured the slaves in the interior. The Arab or Ottoman participation in the slave trade predated the Atlantic slave trade by centuries, yet it did not spark an industrial revolution in Arab Ottoman lands. Similarly, Western nations had already produced key innovations of the Industrial Revolution, such as steam power and steel ships, before they became imperial powers. British India did not yield any economic benefit to the average person in Britain, according to Deirdre McCloskey, although some individuals did become immensely rich. The British public paid for the British Empire and got little out of it. Same applies to other European colonial empires. As Deirdre McCloskey again notes, quote, the glorious Spanish and Portuguese empires left Spain and Portugal at the last among the poorest countries in Europe, end of quote. By contrast, France's prosperity rested on, quote, McCloskey again, French law, French style, French labor, French banking, French education, French originality, French openness to ideas, rather than on, quote again, loading it over poor Muslims in Africa or poor Buddhists in Vietnam. I go on to discuss other unconvincing explanations for the different rates of cultural development and for disparate levels of economic well-being in the modern world, such as geography, natural resources, disease, climate. Instead, I agree with David Landes, who wrote, quote, if we learn anything from the history of economic development, it is that culture makes all the difference, end of quote. By way of illustration, he mentions the relative success of various expatriate minorities in comparison with the dominant population. The Chinese in East and Southeast Asia, Indians in East Africa, Lebanese in West Africa. He also points to the Jews and Calvinists as a successful cultural minorities in much of Europe. In other words, Max Weber was right on, Landes adds, referring to the thesis that Weber made famous in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which was first published in 1904. The economic and technological success of the West began with culture and with principles embodied in its characteristic institutions. The origin of the modern West are often seen in the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th century, but the roots of the Enlightenment can be found in habits of mind cultivated in Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem, and the institutions that grew from them. The Greeks gave us the city and the notion of citizenship, the ideals of democracy and liberty, rationalism and science, philosophy and history. The Romans systematized the law, defined private property, and emphasized individual responsibility. Judeo-Christianity added a sense of conscience and charity, tempering justice with forgiveness, and the concept of linear rather than cyclical time, which allowed the possibility of progress. The Middle Ages brought a deeper synthesis of Athens and Rome, with Jerusalem laying the foundations for the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the Enlightenment, and pluralistic liberal democracy. In Chapter 3, entitled Drugs, Sex, and Rock and Roll, I discuss the myth of Eastern spirituality and Western materialism. In Chapter 4, I take on such taboo subjects as Asian racism, Arab anti-Semitism, Islamic imperialism, the role of Islam and the Arabs in the slave trade, the complicity of black Africans in the enslavement and later selling of fellow Africans to Arabs, Persians, Indians, and Europeans. In Chapter 5, I emphasize some of the strengths of the West, in particular self-criticism, irony, and the scientific method. In Chapter 6, I point to the freedom of religion and freedom of speech as freedoms we take for granted in the West, but which are not respected outside the West. I point to the horrendous treatment of non-Muslims in the Islamic countries, the persecution of religious minorities such as the Baha'is and Zoroastrians in Iran, the Ahmadiyya in Pakistan and Indonesia, and Christians in Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Nigeria, the Sudan, which have often been ignored by the mainstream media. Let us take this. This is not in my book, but I just had to do a 10-minute research on the internet, and I got this horrendous statistics about the treatment of Christians at this moment. And since my main theme in Chapter 6 was both freedom of religion and freedom of press, I think it is here appropriate to mention the plight of the Christians. This is an article. This is quite startling. I had to read it twice to actually believe some of the statistics given there. This is from commentary a few weeks ago. On October 2011, I'm quoting now directly from this article, when the so-called Arab Spring took a dark turn in Cairo, Egypt, the social media and smartphone technologies that had aided protesters in their fight for freedom captured new and dangerous developments. On video hosting websites such as YouTube, one can see footage of Muslim mobs that began throwing rocks at Coptic Christians on October the 8th. These young Copts had been protesting the burning of a Coptic church in Aswan and the failure of the Egyptian authorities to respond satisfactorily. Frustrated with the traditional Coptic adoption of a dhimmi, that is to say a subordinate religious status towards Egypt's Muslim majority, the young Copts defiantly left quick Coptic sections of Cairo to march through Muslim neighborhoods. After the first rocks were thrown, the army came in to suppress the demonstration and ran down protesters with large military vehicles. 25 Copts were killed, making this the largest mass killing of Christians that Egypt has seen in many years. But this incident is about more than the Arab Spring turning into an anti-democratic winter. It is an example of the worldwide plague, growing in frequency and brutality of the persecution of Christians. A Pew Forum study in 2011 estimated that Christians are persecuted either by the government or hostile social forces in an incredible 131 of the world's 193 countries, and they constitute 70% of the world's population. The World Evangelical Alliance believes that 200 million Christians are being singled out for persecution at any one time. At a 2011 Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe conference in Lithuania on the topic of Christian persecution, one delegate estimated, and this is an extraordinary figure, that 105,000 Christians lose their lives every year for their faith, a figure that translates into approximately one Christian killed every 5 minutes. Last fall, the Egyptian Coptic Church's lawyer, Naguib Jibrail, estimated that some 100,000 Christian families had left the country in the preceding months, that since Mubarak's ouster, sectarian strife had escalated in the country. A little over a year ago, 21 Copts died in an attack in church in Alexandria, while last spring another 15 were killed in Imbaba, where 3 Coptic Orthodox churches were burned. It wasn't until October, however, that violence peaked with a new group behind the hostilities, Egypt's Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. And then you had the incident I just described above. If you value freedom, freedom of religion, freedom to change your religion, and freedom not to have any religion, freedom of expression and speech, freedom from arbitrary arrest and search, freedom from state interference in your private life, then you cannot possibly deny that the West is best. The United States, for instance, is the freest society that has ever existed. Take freedom of religion, as I've shown above. The situation outside the West, as I've just talked about, is truly catastrophic for religious minorities and is well documented by the United States Commission on Religious Freedom. Its annual report last week singles out countries that are of particular concern. North Korea, Egypt, Eritrea, Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, China, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Turkey, and so on. I won't go through all the list. To establish, now, coming back to my book, what I was trying to do, to establish that the West is best, you have to establish what values you wish to defend. I mean, perhaps religious freedom, freedom of speech is not important for you. But if it is, if you wish to defend these freedoms, I believe in human rights, for example, in which case I'm bound to find the West is the best, since these rights are respected in a higher degree there than anywhere else. And despite the title, the superlative in the title best, I'm talking comparatively. I'm not saying that the West is perfect. No society on earth is perfect, but that it is best of what is available elsewhere. Except, of course, those countries such as Japan, which have a constitution modeled the United States Constitution. Of course, the West has committed great crimes. Okay, now, one of the criticisms leveled against my book was that I didn't, the reviewer was very sympathetic to the book. This was in commentary. But he said, I wonder what Mr. Warraq would say about World War II. Well, I'll end with this. Thousands died defending those values that are our best hope for a globally peaceful future, that in the Second World War. And then those who perpetrated the crimes against humanity during the Second World War were put on trial, their crimes noted, and then they were punished. Indeed, the trials led to much reflection and resulted, in, to use a phrase that I owe to Fred Siegel, a moment of moral clarity and the drafting of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The whole idea of values and human rights were developed only in the West, based on the United States Constitution, which in turn was based on fundamental European charters, such as the Magna Carta of 1215. In other words, human rights were not created ex nihilo, but Jefferson and others of the founding fathers drew upon a long sustained tradition, turned to the West's rich legacy that went back to the jurists Hugo Grotius and Samuel Pufendorf, and earlier still to the Stoics, and even earlier. Okay, so I'm defending values, principles that are now prevailing, values of a liberal democracy. I'm defending certain values, not everything that's happened in this geographical area we call the West. Quite clearly, this is not possible. So I'm defending values that are prevailing. That is to say, the values of a democracy. West was not always true to itself, as during the period of the dictators and the fascists. Okay, in that case, the West did not live up to its ideals, but millions died fighting for the freedoms we take for granted. So I'll end with this quote from on this issue, and then I'll pass it on to my colleagues. Those regimes, that's to say the Nazis and the totalitarians like the communists, these regimes betrayed and scorned the Western values that had grown and matured over a period of centuries. The notions of the civic state, private property, Roman law, Christian charity, the autonomous person, and the individual conscience. The totalitarian regimes misunderstood or mistrusted the spontaneous order of complex modern societies, and having destroyed it, they created only misery in its place, sacrificing millions of lives on the altar of an artificial ideal. The horrific experiments of Nazism and communism served mostly to demonstrate the superiority of liberal democracy. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I'll offer just a few comments, and we'll see where it goes. I agree with Ibn Warraq's argument. I agree with Ibn Warraq's argument. I don't like his vocabulary, though. The first aspect of it I don't like is the geographical term, West. That when I read Ibn Warraq's book and listen to him now, I see that he carefully makes these distinctions. He understands that not everything from the West is good, but he has to tie himself into knots in saying so. Thus, the West is good, and people like the Nazis have betrayed the West. So the war against Germany was a war in favor of the West against the people who betrayed the West. But this is a kind of vocabulary that doesn't help us to understand anything. Obviously, World War II was a civil war within the West, which then took on global characteristics too. What I think is valid in the argument is a defense, is in the subtitle, the defense of liberal democracy. It's liberal democracy that's valuable. It's not the West. When the West has been for liberal democracy, that's good. When the central power of the West, Germany in mid-20th century, was against liberal democracy, that was bad. Similarly, when people in the rest of the world come out for something that might be described as liberal democracy, that's good. I learn and I note that Ibn Warraq's argument, if you pay close attention to it, is subtler than his own vocabulary. So only from learning, only from reading this book, Why the West is Best, have I learned late in life about the Emperor Asoka in the 3rd century BC in India, who formulated a program of human rights. And thus had done this from a perspective that's obviously geographically Eastern, but might reasonably be counted as a forebear of liberal democracy, and presumably left some sort of heritage that we can see flourishing in considerable degree in the India of our own time, which has drawn from a British liberal democratic traditions, but also enjoys its own commendable traditions and has been able to meld these together. A second thing I don't like is some of the tone of dismissal or insult. For instance, the notion of deriding the Islamic idea of heaven or the other world as a cosmic brothel is funny, and everybody understands why it's funny. And yet, I am not a fan. I am not a fan of Tariq Ramadan. In fact, I boast of being his greatest detractor. But one of the wonderful things I've learned from Tariq Ramadan, having read him closely and then having read his sources, I was led back to this medieval philosopher Al-Ghazali, who wrote a marvelous, fantastic Neoplatonist, phantasmagorical evocation of the cosmos called the niche for lights, or niche of lights, in which he describes an Islamic other world or heaven, which is absolutely marvelous. It's one of the most gorgeous, beautiful, fantastical things I've ever read. A heaven divided by 70,000 veils, each of which reveals a different level of truth. It's a Neoplatonist, fabulous
Paul, excuse me, before you go on, explain to the audience who Tariq Ramadan is. I'm just curious, how many people know who Tariq Ramadan is? It's about half the audience.
I'll repeat that. I mentioned Tariq Ramadan because Ibn Warraq began by explaining that he was in a debate with Tariq Ramadan, who's a Islamic philosopher from Switzerland, now at Oxford, And so Ibn Warraq began by debating with, reminding us of a debate that he had a few years ago with Tariq Ramadan. And Ibn Warraq and I are having a mild dispute right now. Who is the greater detractor of Tariq Ramadan? But I find myself just noting something that I learned from Tariq Ramadan, which is the writings of the medieval philosopher Al-Ghazali, who I realize we could discuss his role in intellectual history, but represents some sort of mixing of East and West, and offers an alternative. Let me say that there's more I could say about a spirit of generosity, which I think would strengthen the argument. I, of course, admire and applaud and stand with Ibn Warraq when he speaks about the oppression of the Christians, Baha'is, and so forth. It's amazing that we live in an era where vast persecutions somehow turn invisible. So right now we're living through a moment in which hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of people who belong in religious minorities are fleeing. Many of those people are Muslims, of course. Shia fleeing from Sunni persecution, or sometimes Sunni fleeing from Shiite persecution. But the Christians are doubtless the largest number of all. But then I conclude by asking, where does this oppression come from? Is it from Easternness, or is it from Islam per se? And I would say it's not from either of those things. It's not from Easternness, because these Christians have been living in a variety of countries more or less peacefully for thousands of years. And it's not from Islam per se either, because Christians were not fleeing from the Muslim world in the 19th century. Outside, if we leave aside the Balkans, they're fleeing right now, and from a specific thing, which I would describe as a political movement. It's not a geographical region, the East. It's not a religion, Islam. It's a political movement, and it's the political movement that is generally known as Islamism, with the suffix ism, identifying a political movement, distinguishing it from the religion. It's the political movement that was founded by the grandfather of Tariq Ramadan, but it's a specific thing. And one of the factors that one of the reasons that makes me regret the vocabulary of West versus the rest, or West versus Islam, is that this is a vocabulary whose real origin right now, I mean, it has an old history, this vocabulary, but its origin right now, its fundamental base right now comes from the Islamist movement. The Islamist movement is the political movement which has said that the West is persecuting Islam, that Islam is under a danger of annihilatory attack from Western and Zionist forces, and must be resisted. And this is a false description of world events, but it's an intellectually seductive one to think that there is in fact a battle between Islam and the West. I do not think there is a battle between Islam and the West. I think that there is a battle between the Islamist movement and its enemies, the enemies that it chooses to adopt for itself. And so I worry that in adopting the geographical language and maybe the tone of dismissal, we fall into the habit of allowing the Islamist categories of analysis to be our own. And this would be a gigantic error. What we want to say, I think, and I think this is actually the fundamental argument that Ibn Warraq makes, and makes brilliantly, apart from my quarrel with his vocabulary, what we want to say is that liberal democracy has a virtue. Liberal democracy has a history which has a geographical aspect, but in itself it is not a geographical concept, nor is it a religious concept. Liberal democracy is a universal concept. And liberal democracy finds itself in a struggle beset by people who oppose it. It has found itself in such a struggle repeatedly over the last 100 years, from Nazis, from communists, and from Islamists. And this struggle, which has been the struggle of the last 100 years, is the struggle we find ourselves in now, and we must be sure to maintain the integrity of our own concepts. In struggling against Nazis, we didn't want to say that, no, you are the inferior race, we're the superior race. We wanted to say, no, we are liberal Democrats, and your racial theories are crazy. To the communists, we didn't want to say, no, we are the bourgeoisie, we want to oppress the proletariat, you are for the proletariat. No, on the contrary, we wanted to say, we are liberal democracy. Your idea of a proletarian world is actually a mendacity that leads to oppression of the workers themselves. Likewise, to the Islamists, we want to say, no, it's not that we are the West and we are against you because you are inferior. We want to say, we are for liberal democracy. You should embrace it. The liberal democracy has room for all the religions and the non-religions. The liberal democracy is not a geographical concept, it's a concept for the entire world. Thank you.
Well, I want to start by thanking Fred for inviting me. I want to congratulate Ibn Warraq on a very provocative and thought-provoking book. And of course, it's such an honor and a pleasure to be on a panel with Paul Berman. I've shared this with him privately, and I don't think he'll mind if I share it publicly. It was reading Terror and Liberalism and then Flight of the Intellectuals just about 2 years ago that made me want to do journalism. So it's just wonderful to be next to him and sharing this panel. I also broadly agree with Ibn Warraq's thesis. I'm not going to wade into the sort of the geographic contention. However, more or less, I do think the West is best. And for me, what struck me most about his book was what I would call the banality of freedom. It's a play on banality of evil, except in this case, I mean that in a positive sense. I mean that in the way that Ibn Warraq is exuberant about Broadway musicals and what they say about American liberal democracy, about a magazine stand, which to me, having been born and raised in Iran and moved here when I was 13, almost 14, an American magazine stand is truly as miraculous a thing, as sacred a thing, as Ibn Warraq describes it. I'll share another anecdote, another personal anecdote of why, in a very simple sense, the West, or liberal democracy, is indeed best, and how I experienced it. It was when I was taking my flight out of Iran with my mother and my grandmother. It was a KLM flight. And again, I think this is one of those banality of freedom moments. If you're flying out of Iran, in this case it was a KLM flight, it's a non-Iranian airline. At some point, the flight attendant will come on the intercom or whatever, and she'll say, like, boop, ladies and gentlemen, we've left the Islamic Republic's airspace. And in my case, and I've heard it's not an isolated one, people started clapping, right? And some 24 women took off their headscarves, right? Because they knew that sort of the regime's morality police wouldn't be there to, beat them up and say, like, mind your veil, sister. That's just not going to happen anymore, because you're in the physical space of liberal democracy. Now, I think that to stop there and say, magazine stands and so forth, and that sort of very basic freedom that's represented in that moment, I think it's to do the West some injustice, because, again, to go back to the loftier realms that Ibn Warraq mentioned, including literature, painting, and so forth. I think there's an enormous debt of gratitude that Middle Eastern literature and Islamic literature has to pay, that it has not paid to literary modernism that originated in the West. There was an anthology that came out about a year ago, edited by an Iranian-American journalist by the name of Reza Aslan. It was called Tablet and Pen, and it's an anthology of modernist Middle Eastern literature. And the framing of the anthology was very much around the idea that the Middle East's literature across national and religious boundaries is defined by one singular idea, and that's anti-colonialism and anti-Western sentiments. Now, in fact, many of the poets and novelists and short story writers that were featured in the anthology had no anti-Western bones to pick. But even the ones that did, what was remarkable about it is that in terms of literary form, they wouldn't exist were it not for Whitman, were it not for Kafka. In other words, even in articulating anti-Western sentiments, Middle Eastern literature of the past 100 years or so is influenced by and shaped by, in terms of literary form, to Western modernity. Persian poetry does not sound like Saadi and Hafez of the 10th century with its sort of very arcane verse. It looks like poetry does after it comes into encounter with Whitman. So again, I think both in that everyday sense and in a high culture sense, the West is indeed best. Where I would disagree with Ibn Warraq, where there might be some contention, is at least to read his book, one gets the sense that liberal democracy as we know it today, at its cultural height, was sort of this naturally preordained synthesis of Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome, and then perfectly melded into the early medieval period, then the Renaissance, then the Enlightenment, and here we are today. And I would say that in fact it's a much more traumatic process that's brought us here, a series of historical ruptures, including the Enlightenment itself, the French Revolution. These were not easy experiences, and they were quite revolutionary. And I think we're going through one today. Both in the Muslim world, we're going through some of those traumas that need to happen in order for individual rights to become the standard there. But also here, except the one that's going on here, the trauma is a sort of a quiet trauma. And it goes back to why Ibn Warraq has to write his book in the first place, or why Paul Berman has to defend someone like Ayaan Ali Hirsi, or Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And on the other hand, to have prominent Western intellectuals singing the praises of an Islamist ideologue like Tariq Ramadan. So I think there's a crisis at work where we've lost a sense of self-confidence, and believe it or not, through a process of almost counter-transference, it's impacting Middle Eastern liberals that are emerging. And I'll close with this anecdote. So about 6-7 months ago, I met a young woman who had been involved in Iran's Green Movement. And because of her involvement, she had been imprisoned, but she wasn't high enough of a figure in terms of dissidence for the regime to keep her. At some point, they released her from Tehran's hellish Evin prison, and they said, look, if you just go to the West, be gone, you'll be fine. And she made it here, and she, I won't go into the details, but she's, to go through Evin prison is to see, a living nightmare. And I met with her in Boston on Huntington Avenue in a very beautiful day. We were having coffee, and at one point, she said, look, I've been through this stuff. She told me her story, but let me tell you something. I think that women are just as unfree here. I mean, I read this guy Zizek who told me that that there's an even deeper totalitarianism at work in this environment. There, it's a crude dictatorship that did X, Y, Z to me, but here it's even worse because it works in such silent ways. And I was shocked. I mean, I was like, you've been to Evin prison. look at us. We're here, we're sitting here, a man and a woman who aren't related, who share, dissident ideas about how the Iranian government should look and sound like. And yet, you're telling me that, this sort of, well, yeah, the West is just as bad. So the crisis that's at play there, I think, needs an explanation, and I think that Athens and Jerusalem and Rome don't have an answer for it, but we desperately need one, because it's not only impacting our cultural self-confidence, but also it's sort of being transferred there. So I'll maybe stop there.
Sohrab, thank you.
The problem of vocabulary, well, Roger Scruton once said to me, if you write, you must write to offend as many people as possible. Well, I began, the whole tone perhaps was set by my debate with Tariq Ramadan, which was a polemical stance, and I was also frustrated and fed up with political correctness in where you won't, this is absolutely true, my former friend and mentor, Dr. Paul Kurtz, who was the first one to hire me and who published my first book, Why I'm Not Muslim, actually felt very, very uneasy in actually using the word Western civilization. He says, we can't talk about that. We can't say that. It was this was this. On top of that, there's this extraordinary Western self-loathing amongst Western intellectuals, largely liberals, which needs explanation. And I was also reacting against them, and I wanted to put forward a very clear-cut, aggressive, if you like, argument for certain values which are best represented in the West right now. So I do regret it, and I'm glad that Paul did see through some of the subtler points. As for Ashoka, I'd also mention some Iranian precursors. I also talk about, perhaps not so much in this book, but in Defending the West, I do mention that there are all sorts of very, very courageous people in the Middle East who are fighting for the values that we take for granted. And that's why many of my friends don't like me using the term Islamist, because they think that I'm giving in and I'm going soft in my old age. But it's a way to reach out to the people who are fighting for the same rights. It's not so easy for people in the Middle East to say the kind of things we are saying tonight. Okay, I've just got a couple. The Al-Ghazali, I don't share Paul's admiration for Al-Ghazali. I do mention him in a very negative way in this book and in my book on Edward Said. He was responsible, I think, for holding back the development of the scientific movement within Islam, and I do mention the legacy of Islamic Renaissance, if you like, the Islamic research done by Islamic philosophers and Islamic scientists. But it was all, there was no sustained tradition. There's no sustained tradition which lasted. And many people like me think that Al-Ghazali was the man responsible by his philosophy of occasionalism, but I won't go into that now. But also the last point that Paul made about the oppression coming, well, I disagree profoundly there. It's not a recent phenomenon, and I know that Paul agrees with people like Matthaus Kunzel that the anti-Semitism that you see in the Islamic world, he thinks it all came from the Nazis. I just don't accept that. It's been there, it's doctrinal, it's deeply entrenched, and you just have to read something like the legacy of Islamic anti-Semitism. It dates from from the Koran, from the Hadith, from throughout the centuries, from all the Muslim law schools, whether Sunni or Shia. Okay. Sohrab's point, yes, it is. There were all sorts of traumatic moments, and I do glide over them rather quickly. But I was just trying to defend the West from certain attacks, that it's racist, it's imperialist, and it's fascist, and so on. So I was on the defensive, and I had to make my point in a book of less than 300 pages. So I had to really get in all my arguments as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I certainly understand the length constraints. I guess what I meant by trauma is that liberal democracy, as we know it, was also in opposition to traditions in the West, right? I mean, feudalism had to be set aside. All sorts of superstitions had to be set aside, and that's the sort of trauma that the Islamic world is going through, frankly, many centuries later, but that it needs to. And so, in other words, what I meant is that it's not a flaw in the West, but that it's not, that Western perfection isn't as preordained as maybe you make it seem.
I'm just going to make two brief comments. One, I would add a concept to this discussion, and that's the concept of equality before the law. The idea of a single standard of justice. I would argue that what binds together fascism, communism, and multiculturalism is the attempt to create multiple standards, not holding everyone to the same single standard without regard to race, creed, or religion, as the saying goes. But that's debatable. One point on Tariq Ramadan. Yesterday I read an article in a French paper about Tariq Ramadan's response to the massacre in Toulouse. I think you remember this. Mohamed Morah had killed several French soldiers of Muslim origin, and then he went into a schoolyard and killed at point blank range 3 Jewish school children and their father. In saying on tape, he did this quite directly for anti-Semitic reasons. In his essay, Tariq Ramadan, who's a very clever man and appeals to the Western multiculturalist sense of guilt, couldn't bring himself to acknowledge either the jihadist elements in Morah's killings or the anti-Semitic ones. He simply danced around them. I think that's why he's become this figure that has to be dealt with, because he has a very clever way of covering the worst elements of Islamism, as Paul refers to it, in a kind of gravy, a rich gravy of vacuous language, to give you some sense of Tariq Ramadan.
Good evening, guys. I was reading evening.
Your name, your
okay.
St. Francis student.
My name is Zalia. I'm a St. Francis student. And I was reading page 109. It says, African Americans who convert to Islam regard Christianity as an unforgiven.
Page 109 of?
Why the best, worst is the best. The history of slavery and racism. Okay, during history in Africa, I'm usually African, and learning history back home was telling us how our family, our forefathers closed their eyes. Before they opened their eyes, they were given Bible, and their lands was took away from them. So us learning a lot about slavery, I don't know why the book has to say African Americans convert to the religion because they feel like Christianity was backbiting them or just taking over them. I think that is misinterpreted in your book, and I don't understand it.
The sentence, African Americans who convert to Islam, that one.
Christianity as
Yes, that's been, I mean, I've got that from reading African Americans, like Malcolm X's autobiography. He goes into that. Oh, fair enough. Fair enough. That's one of the reasons. But you're right. There are others who are convert for positive reasons. Yes. Point taken.
My question is directed to Mr. Berman. So you had said that it's not necessarily this Judeo-Christian tradition or Greek philosophy or Roman history, law, Greek influence, but that liberal democracy is essentially the virtue. And I assume that you say that with a deeper understanding of Islam and Islamic text than I have. So can you point to where in the text specifically liberal democracy is valued in Islam?
Well, I don't think that liberal democracy per se is valued by any of the ancient religions, because I think that liberal democracy is a modern idea, which is developed out of ancient roots, and it has developed in many places. Obviously, liberal democracy developed in Europe out of some struggle with internally with Christian theology, but this did not prevent Jews from taking it up, even though the leading Jewish contributor to this development was, as Mr. Warraq points out in his book, was formally excommunicated by the Jewish community, Baruch
Spinoza, as Paul was referring to.
So far as Islam goes, I could answer you by quoting this or that line from the Koran, not to boast of my Quranic credentials, but you have your religion, I have mine, and there are many lines like this that are quoted by people who want to defend liberal democracy in a Quranic language. That can certainly be done, and there is a literature of people who do that. But I would make a different argument, which is just to say that liberal democracy is a product of world civilization, and in this world civilization, many elements have contributed, and there have been moments in the past about which I think none of us disagree, in which Islam has made these contributions. It's true this contribution was not made by my man Al-Ghazali, who was had a dark side to him, but if you look at other philosophers of the Islamic Golden Age, at Averroes and other people, you can see major contributions to the vein, to the line of thinking that went from ancient Greece and Jerusalem through the Middle Ages, especially through the Islamic Middle Ages, then back into Europe. So that the modern civilization as it exists now is something that can look back, in fact, with satisfaction and admiration at the contributions from the Greeks, the Romans, the Hebrews, the medieval Muslims, certain of the Christian theological debates, and a variety of Jews. It's not a religiously exclusive development. The medieval period is often still in the popular mind is associated with the Dark Ages and so on, but responsible historians no longer think of the Middle Ages in that way. And I tried to talk about the Carolingian Renaissance. I talk about the contributions to science by people like Roger Bacon and Robert Grosseteste and so on. And these there were all sorts of there were all sorts of popes who advocated the separation of church and state, which I think is also fundamental in a liberal democracy, and which go for, even St. Augustine talked about that. It goes back to Aeschylus and so on. So I think they are unjustly, and the Crusades, of course, were
another matter. I prepared about 5 pages on the Crusades, but I won't go into that now.
Well, listen, I mean, the answer to that is that the fashionable thinkers who are fashionable here are quite fashionable in Tehran as well. So, for example, Zizek, Chomsky, and so forth. In some sense, that's in a subversive way, right? Because when someone like Zizek or Chomsky rails against whatever prevailing order, although I know they come from complete. He's a Marxian, like, psychoanalytic philosopher.
Just let me help. Zizek was brought to University of Illinois Chicago Circle recently. He drew 1,000 people, a huge overflow crowd. I asked the people who sponsored him, what did he say? They couldn't give me an explanation. So I read the text. I still couldn't understand, except to say he calls himself a Lacanian Leninist. If somebody can explain that to me, I'll give them a prize. I'm sorry, sir.
And again, I'm not saying all these intellectuals come at how to be on the left from the same direction, but one way or the other, they sort of rage against the prevailing order. And when a young Iranian reads that, it means the most tangible prevailing order that exists in their lives is the Islamist regime. So perhaps Chomsky or Zizek, in spite of themselves, are actually advancing a hawkish foreign policy. I kid, but I think no. But the bigger point is that these people are taken seriously, and they have an influence. And as ludicrous as it seems for someone to have been in prison in Iran to say that I feel just as unfree here because of the way women are sexualized in American advertising and so forth, these ideas are there. What did I say to her? I said that's ludicrous. But we agreed to disagree.
Thank you very much.
Lisa Paul wants to pick up on that.
I'd like to comment on this too. I'll leave aside Al-Ghazali. We'll have a medieval disputation at some other moment. But Sohrab's point about Middle Eastern literature today being so strongly influenced by the literature of the West, and even Walt Whitman, is, I think, true. By the way, that's a point with a local meaning, because it's not just that Whitman was from Brooklyn and lived a few blocks from here, but the first of his Arab followers was Khalil Gibran, who lived on Atlantic Avenue and created a cult for Whitman, which he introduced into the Levant. So I think this is true, that we can observe a modern quality to intellectual life in the Middle East and in the larger Muslim world. But then I would just extend this point about Zizek and Chomsky and other people whom we, at least on the table here, might complain about, by pointing out that Islamism, the political movement itself, reflects these modern influences. And here's the little quarrel, I think, between Ibn Warraq and myself on the topic of anti-Semitism. That yes, and Al-Ghazali unfortunately does play into this, because one of Al-Ghazali's followers returned from Baghdad in the 12th century to Morocco and instigated a gigantic pogrom against the Moroccan Jews. So this sort of thing is true, and there is a history of anti-Semitism, of hatred for the Jews within the entire Islamic world. There are episodes in the history of the Islamic world in Yemen and Morocco and other places in the Middle Ages that are just horrific, that are on a European scale nearly. For being horrific against the Jews. But I would point out in regard to this that Christianity likewise has a history of persecuting the Jews. And if we were to make a global comparison, which region has been worse for the Jews, Christian Europe or the Muslim world? Well, there's a dispute among the historians, and it is actively disputed. But I point to I point to the historian at Princeton, Mark Cohn, and then his master in these things, Bernard Lewis, who make the argument that on balance, it was worse in Christian Europe over the centuries than it was in the Muslim world. And this is why, on balance, Jews fled from Europe to the Muslim world and not from the Muslim world to Christian Europe. And of course, there's an irony to this, which is that when the early Zionists came up with the idea of forming finally a Jewish state, the idea was that by forming the Jewish state in Palestine and in what was ancient Israel, they would be entering a more sympathetic atmosphere than they were fleeing from in Europe.
I just have to rebut that last comment. I'm sorry, but if you look at the population of Jews in Europe, there were still 8 million Jews in Europe when Hitler came to power. There were about 1 million Jews in the Middle East. Now, those demographics should tell you that it was actually much worse in the Middle East for Jews than in Europe. Thank you.
Let me respond to that. Because of the 8 million, it's usually considered 9 million, 2/3 of them were murdered. This has not happened in the modern Middle East. Now, the reason it's the 1 million Jews of the Middle East were persecuted, did live under oppression, and the overwhelming majority of them fled. And they fled and formed their own state. But this was something that the European Jews were not able to do. Nothing has been worse than the massacre of the European Jews. It's true that we're working up a debate here. I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm a giant Ibn Warraq fan. And have said so repeatedly in print. So I am quibbling with him over vocabulary and medieval history, I think, are the two themes at the moment. On the question of Islam and the separation of church and state, or mosque and state, I would point out, let's restrict the discussion for the moment simply to intellectuals. Within the world of intellectuals, there is a vigorous debate over this. And there's a debate in which the progressive liberal side of it is upheld by noble atheists, whom I salute, but is also upheld by noble Muslims who are pious Muslims. And I'll cite a very distinguished book by Abdullahi Ahmed An-Naim, who is a professor at Emory Law School in the United States, has written a book called Islam and the Secular State, in which of which the first sentence is, "I need a secular state in order to be a good Muslim." And the rest of the book follows from that. So my response is just to say that the argument is there. The liberal Muslims are there. They write brilliant books. It's an open question. We're in the middle of that battle now.
You said that the Quran determines life for the Muslims, rather billions of Muslims and we believe it's a way of life. And the sexual abuse of children in the Islamic world, as you say in your book, you failed to mention that there is sexual abuse of children in Latin America and in different parts of the world. However, you focus a lot on that it's happening in the Muslim world. Let's see. And then there is hypocrisy all over the world. For example, one point that you mentioned is Saudi prince drinking wine or liquor at his house one night and then judging a gentleman the next day and sending him to jail for drinking. However, hypocrisy exists all over the world. It exists here, it exists on the next block, it exists in the government, in every single government.
I'm not picking out one individual to an individual's act, but if the individual's act is based on the founding text, the sacred text, then it's another matter altogether. It's far more serious than that. Of course, yes. You say that the Islamic world is not guilty. Not only the Islamic world is guilty of terrible crimes, but I put it the other way around. It was my defense of the West, where I say the West, not only the West is guilty of terrible crimes. That's all.
I'd like to know whether, in light of your description by all of you, that liberal democracy is the basic benefit of Western civilization. Would you agree that the greatest danger at present to that greatest benefit is not Islamism at all, but rather the rise of conservatism?
No, I don't think that is true at all. I think even the evangelical Christians, they're absolute pussycats in comparison to the jihadi imams. It's a complete and utter nonsense. This is the kind of moral equivalence argument which drives me crazy, which can only become from soft-minded liberals in their most ecumenical state of mind. It's just absolute nonsense. Where they even a conservative, even a Republican, has to go by the Constitution. This is complete nonsense. I'm sorry.
So my name is Miriam. I'm a St. Francis student. So, in my personal opinion, your book seems to be claiming that it is a defense of Western values, as you said on the panel tonight as well. But instead, it seems to be an attack on Islamic values as opposed to Eastern values. Or at least for the most part, your writing seems to be confused and intertwines the two.
What's your question?
And it's sad to see that no one was invited to speak here on this panel to defend and represent Islam when it is actually a religion of peace. And we do have some extremists, but you get that in every religion and faith. So my question to you is, according to what you write in your book, you say that the Koran goes against the fundamental laws of science. So I was wondering if you could provide at least 2 examples of that. Thank you.
There are over 200 verses in the Quran which advocate killing